Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the 50-Day Property Challenge. Once again, as every day during this challenge, we have Jared Ricketts and Matt L joining us on this journey. And today, especially, we welcome our special guest, David Beatty. He is, in my perspective, or from my perspective, the best educator within the property management space. He works with the Enterprise Development Property Fund and the EDPF Property Academy on a regular basis, where he helps to educate our entrepreneurs and those of us who want to join the property sector within the property management space. So welcome, David. I will ask you today to just introduce yourself to the audience and tell us all about yourself. And then once you have done that, you can then please start talking to us about how to manage your property from a leasing perspective, from a tenancy perspective, and all the good things that you have to teach us. So, David, I will hand over to you, and I hope that the public, and especially Jared and Matt L, will enjoy the journey today.
Thanks so much, Nigel. Really appreciate it. It's very exciting to be part of this group. And it's so great to be having a discussion with Jared and Mattel, and it's exciting to be part of your guys' journey. As we know, long-term success, long-term wealth property is definitely one of the main, if not the main way to do it. So it's great to be part of this journey. So I am David Beatty. I am the owner and founder of Chorus Property Group. We manage around about 1,000 rentals across Cape Town and Johannesburg, mainly in the residential space. I'm also author of the Expert Landlord book, which is available in most bookstores. But the main thing is that book is, I wrote the book so that the average wannabe property investor and property investor can get the basics of the A to Z of property investing. You know what? It's not that complicated to be a property investor, to manage your property. It's just a question of knowing a couple of skills, and then you can be on your way. We all learn. Sometimes the hard way, and I think that sometimes to do some of the mistakes is sometimes the best way, to learn. I'm also a husband of my wife Karen, and the father of three lovely daughters, and I'm excited to assist others and those around us in this country to achieve their God-given potential. Okay, so we today are talking about property management, and I want to just go through a couple of ideas as to how to manage your rental property like a pro. Hopefully, what you guys will get out of it is that you'll get the confidence that proper property management can make you money and save you time and hassle. So the property management is often where investors kind of, the tucker hits a tar, where it gets a little rough sometimes because it's nice and sexy to buy the property, but to build ongoing sustainable wealth, one has to manage your property professionally on an ongoing basis. And, as I said, it's not that complicated. It's a question of putting some systems in place. But if you do get it wrong, it is often one of the main reasons why investors get out of the game. And we wouldn't want you to do that, because one of the benefits of property investing is to get the long-term asset growth and long-term return on investment. And also, hopefully, you'll leave this short conversation today with the confidence that every landlord can be an expert at property management. I bought my first property over 20 years ago. I made some silly mistakes, and my first tenant, an agent who I bought the property from, placed a tenant for me. I really knew nothing. The tenant ended up being a drug addict, not paying their rent. Fortunately, he disappeared one day, and I managed to get my property back. And since then, I realized that long-term property management is the key. Professional property management is the key to ongoing property investment success. Just a little bit about my business as well. We do sexual title management, rental management, which is our main business, and also sales across Cape Town and Johannesburg. So what is property management? Very simply, property management is the process of managing a rental property by attending to the day-to-day activities centered around the property. It's managing it's attending to the day-to-day activities around the property. And in my view, it's made up of two main elements. Number one is tenant placement. Especially in this market, tenant placement is particularly important. You want to place the right tenant at the right time, at the right price. And in the second part of property management is rental management, which is basically the ongoing management of your property once your tenant has been placed. I've got which will show in the graphic, I've got a little life cycle called the property management life cycle. And basically what it is the life cycle is made up of 5 main points. And the first stage in the life cycle is to market your property effectively so that you can attract the right quality of tenant. We'll go through what a quality tenant is and the definitions of a quality tenant in a minute. But basically you want your property to look as attractive as possible, to be priced correctly, and then to be marketed correctly to the market to attract the right quantity and quality of potential tenants. Once you've shown your property to the tenants and you've got some interest from a tenant or two who would like to move into the property, you're going to go through stage 2 of the life cycle, which is to screen the tenants. And you want to make sure that the tenant is of sufficient quality that they will look after your property and pay their rent on an ongoing basis. I'll go through that in a second as well as to how to screen an interested tenant. The third stage is super important in setting your property management up for success, which is onboarding your tenant, your new tenant as well as possible. This builds a strong foundation so that the rest of the management goes smoothly and as successfully as possible. Stage number 4 gets into the rental management side of things, which is managing your rental by keeping your tenant happy, by making sure that your property is well maintained, and the basics such as rent collection and so forth, dealing with tenant complaints, tenant queries, and so forth. And the last stage in the property management life cycle is moving your tenant out. So 40 to 60 days prior to the end of the lease agreement, you're going to contact your tenant and say, hey, do you want to stay on, or would you like to move out of the property at the end of the lease? If they want to move, if they want to stay on, you will just do a renewal lease with negotiate the terms of the next lease, and finalize that on the lease agreement. And if they want to move out, well, then you do a move out inspections with the tenant on the move out date. Obviously, you'll do a stage 1 in parallel to stage 5 if the tenant's moving out. In other words, that month before the tenant moves out, you're marketing for a replacement tenant. So hopefully that makes some kind of sense on a very brief understanding of how what the life cycle is of property management. So how do we know whether we're succeeding in property management or not? This is a good question, because if you're doing, it can be a little complicated. You've got all these different activities to do, and then what do you prioritize, and what is super important, and what is actually important in property management? And in my view, every landlord and property investor has 4 main needs. It's 4 main needs, and these are in order of importance. So if you're doing your activities, you're filtering your activities in terms of these 4 main needs, it means that you're going to look at, you're going to get the most productive and efficient property management. And the main need, so these are the 4 main needs. The main need in order of importance is you want to maximize your income. Every landlord needs to first be interested in the money coming in. Are you getting the rent in every month? And are you getting the full rent that you've billed? Are you getting that in every month? So the 2 main areas, the main levers for maximizing your cash flow is 2 things really. It's number 1 is tenant occupancy levels. So is your property occupied for 12 months of the year, or as close to 12 months of the year? And the second of all, the second lever is rent collection. So if you're billing 100 Rand a month to your tenant for 12 months, you should be getting 1,200 Rand for the 12 months. If you don't find a tenant for the 1 month, you're going to collect 1,100 Rand only out of the potential 1,200 Rand you should be collecting for your property. If your tenant is occupying the property for the entire year, but is not paying the full rent, let's say they're only paying 80 Rand a month. That means you get 80 times 12, that's 960 Rand out of the 1,200 Rand rental per year. So just bear in mind, those are the two main levers we think about. Am I marketing my property effectively to get a tenant in as quickly as possible? And number two, when a tenant is in, am I billing accurately? Am I making sure that the rent I billed, I'm actually collecting and getting in typically on the first of the month? So in our rental management business, managing hundreds and thousands of properties, those are the two main areas that we focus on a daily basis. Are as many properties as possible occupied, and the properties that are occupied, are we collecting rent on them? The second main need of landlords is the condition of their property. Bear in mind is that part of your property investment is not only the cash flow return or income that you're getting from the property, it's also the long-term growth in the value of the asset over a period of time. So if you, typically in a normal market, you're getting say 5 or 10%, I don't know, asset growth in your property. Say your property is worth 100,000 Rand this year, and next year it will be worth say 105,000 Rand or 110,000 Rand. That extra 5 or 10,000 Rand in asset growth is where a lot of long-term property investors are really getting their wealth. But if you're not looking after your property well, then your property will not go up in value in terms of the way the cycle, the inflation, property price inflation goes up. If your property is deteriorating, and which every property does do over the long term, and you're not looking after your property, your 100,000 Rand property next year will probably only still be worth 100,000 or maybe only 95,000 Rand. So you want to make sure that your property is well maintained over the long term. And you're going to do that, but just by making sure that you're doing proper move-in inspections with your tenants, you're doing proper move-out inspections with your tenants, and that you're maintaining your property well over the long term. But I'll touch on that a little bit just now as well. The third main need of a landlord is around the administration of their property. That's when it comes to the lease agreement, making sure the filing is happening, making sure that the utilities and the municipal accounts and the levies are all up to date, and just making sure that your paperwork is up to date so that every year when you have to submit all your information to the South African Revenue Services, that you don't have to go scrambling for your administration. Now, the reason why it's in the short term, it's okay. In the long term, you can't build a property portfolio if you don't have strong basic administration systems. So, and you can't, like your own little personal system is, you know, maybe you'd look at your bank account on the first of every month to check that your rents come in. Maybe you want to make sure that your levies and your municipal rates are up to date on a monthly basis. These are quite simple to put together on a routine or a rhythm basis, but it is important that your administration is up to date. And the fourth main need of landlords is peace of mind. Some of our landlords are the most, hardcore people or hard-nosed business people, but the emotion of having peace of mind is always super important, no matter who the landlord is and no matter who we are. If we're not sleeping well at night, so I wake up at 3 in the morning and say, oh, freak, I've got this property investment. If you're not thinking, if you don't have that initial thought of, oh no, it's all fine, my systems and everything is under control, so actually it's all cool. What's going to happen in the medium to long term is that you're going to sell your assets, or it's going to be too much stress and you won't be able to build your asset base. So that peace of mind is super important. So the 4 main needs is maximize your cash flow, make sure your property asset is looked after, make sure your administration is under control, and you want peace of mind. What we've done in our business called as Property Group is that we've got a system called Expert Care Program, and the CARE of care stands for these 4 main needs. And the C is for cash flow, the A is for asset, the R is for reconcile, and the E is for exclusive or peace of mind. So maybe that's just something that when you get into the game is just to remember that CARE acronym. You're caring for your property and your long-term wealth creation, but the CARE is in fact the 4 main needs of yourself as a landlord. While we're on the subject of property management, I'm just one of the questions we often get is, do I manage my property myself, or do I get a rental agency to manage my property? And the answer to this question is depends. In the ideal world, I would recommend to any landlord to manage their own property if they are able to and have the capacity to, because by doing it, they learn all the tricks of the trade. They learn what typically happens in property management. They learn where the hurdles are and so forth, so that when they do, or if they do delegate the property management out to a rental agency, the wool won't be pulled over their eyes, and they'll be able to ask the right questions of their agency. Of course, some reasons why you would want to outsource your rental management straight away is that if I'm buying a property in another city, for example, if the property is, say, half an hour or an hour's drive away, if I've got an exceptionally busy job, maybe I'm an executive and I'm working 14-hour days, and I actually don't have the capacity to give any attention to my property, I would outsource the property management. But if you have the time and energy, I would highly recommend you do it up front. We tend to find that as landlords build their portfolio, say they've got 3, 4, 5, 6 units, then they start delegating out, or they start outsourcing the property management. And then landlords that get 100, 200 properties, some of them start bringing their property management in-house again. But that's kind of a typical experience that we have. One of my landlords I'm actually working with at the moment, they got 4 properties with us, and he's now a busy family man, got a top job, and he actually said he just can't handle these 4 properties anymore. He has to outsource the management to us, and he will pay what it takes just to get the hassle off his desk. But up to this point, he had the capacity and the wisdom and the skills to actually manage those properties really, really well himself. But the thing is, he's got the skills to now expect and now to ask the right questions of me. Also, we can repartee in rent management or the rent value or what to do in the situation, because he's done it himself. And in the long term, I think that's a great skill for a landlord to have. I think I know what it is to do a move-in inspection at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning, or to take a phone call at 8 o'clock at night or something. And it's not that it makes landlords more sympathetic of us as rental agents, but it gives them some kind of understanding as to why we put systems in place. I'm just going to touch on a couple of odds and ends. The rental, every business environment operates in a legislative environment. Just to go on to the legislative environment, I'm not going to go into the details within this talk, but just so you're aware of the legislation that the rental management or the property investors operate under, especially residential. Number 1 is the Rental Housing Act of 1999, the PI Act, which deals with evictions, and then the Consumer Protection Act, which deals with some of the legalities around what's in lease agreements and so forth. But nevertheless, it's I would highly recommend the Rental Housing Act is to read through that act. There's also a couple of comments that go with that act, which are also super easy to read. On theexpertlandlord.com, my website, theexpertlandlord.com, you'll find some free downloads on legislation, and maybe you want to have a look through it. It's not complicated. I'm not one to read heavy legal stuff, and I even find this reading quite easy. So let's talk about going to the beginning of the rental management process. And the first thing you want to do is you want to place a quality tenant. Now, I'm just going to talk about the tenant placement side of things, as opposed to kind of the details of getting your property ready and so forth and valuing your property. I'm just going to talk about what is a quality tenant. Now, a quality tenant is made up of 3 main factors. I sometimes have people saying to me, I've got a great tenant, and he pays the 7th of every month, and he's a great guy. Well, that is not the definition of a quality tenant. The definition of a quality tenant must hit these 3 criteria. Number 1 is that they pay well, and what paying well means is that they pay in full, on time, every month. There's no point paying in full every second month. It's no point paying a part of your rent on time every month. You must pay in full on time every month. That means that it's a well-paying tenant. A tenant that you have to follow up on the 7th or 8th of every month, it's not a good tenant, and it's an issue that needs to be dealt with. A second quality of a second factor of a quality tenant is they look after your property well. Now, on every property, as I said, there is a definite wear and tear that happens over the years. I've seen properties empty for 6 months and there's wear and tear on the property just by the fact it's empty. But notwithstanding any wear and tear on a property, a tenant typically should be looking after your property. It's really useful if it's a detailed tenant, and sometimes they do their own little, odds and ends on the property and so forth. But ultimately, you don't want them to smash up your property. Dirty tenants or messy tenants is one thing, but damaging tenants is another thing. And you want your tenants to look after your property. And then thirdly, they behave well. So a tenant who pays on time in full every month and who looks after your property, but there's constant complaints. I mean, we had a complaint this week in one of our Joburg inner city properties where there was some domestic violence. The tenant and his girlfriend had a knife fight. Now, I mean, they paid rent typically well, and they're great people, but when we get complaints from the body corporate about knife fights and blood being around the place, it's not necessarily a great tenant. So obviously now we're dealing with a tenant, finding out what the story is and everything. But behaving well is a super important part of a quality tenant. So I'm hoping that gives you some kind of framework in which to say this is a quality tenant. A quality tenant isn't someone that we feel sorry for. Now, I'm as much as anyone, I have a soft heart for people, wanting to serve people, wanting to do the best for people. But as a landlord, decide that this is a business transaction, and that first and foremost, the best way to serve people is by using strong business foundations, which is these factors I'm talking through. In context of this, if you're collecting a rent every month, you now have an opportunity to then serve people, the tenants and so forth. If you're not getting a rent in every month, what's going to happen is that you're going to go out of business and you're going to lose your property, and then no one wins. So really do keep good business principles. So I hope that works well. How do you screen for a quality tenant? So a tenant, if I'm a tenant and I'm interested in renting your property, you would give me an application form. I would fill out that application form and sign the bottom so that a credit check can be done on me. I would then submit that application form to the landlord or to the rental agent, together with 3 months bank statements, copy of my ID, and a salary slip, preferably 2 to 3 months salary slips. What you want to do is you want to find out first and foremost, and there will be we will put a schedule up. And it is in the book, The Expert Landlord, and you can actually download it from the expertlandlord.com website. There is a tenant screening like a process flow. So let me just go through that process flow. The first thing you want to do is set your standards. What are the standards of the kind of tenant that you are going to allow to stay in your property? Now, you're not allowed to discriminate on gender or race or belief systems and those kind of things, obviously. But the only thing that we can so-called discriminate on is financial capability or viability of a tenant. And that's really what you are screening on. So you want to check that, just some basic criteria that you want to use as standards of the kind of tenant you want to attract. Number one would be you want to pretty much at least 3 times income. So if the rent is 3,000 Rand, you want them to earn 9,000 or more. You want good references, not only from the existing landlord, but previous landlords. You want an acceptable tenant credit record, and you want a clean rental record. So you want 3 times rental income, you want good references, and you want an acceptable credit record, which you're going to get on Tenant Profile Network or Experian, or any other, or ITC, or any other credit bureau. And you want a clean rental record. Is there a record of the rental payments? It typically would be on the bank statement. I would also suggest, so step 2 on the tenant screening would be pre-screening your tenants. So one of the ways you're going to pre-screen your tenants is by making sure that your advert has got the criteria that you're looking for and the do's and don'ts on that property. For example, if a tenant, if your property is not allowed tenants or the body corporate doesn't allow, not allow pets, then put that on your ad. So pre-screen as many on factors as possible so that you're not getting inquiries from tenants that are not going to meet your criteria. I would also, when dealing with a tenant, bear in mind every tenant is analyzing their landlord and the property from the minute they see your ad. Likewise, we as landlords and rental agents need to be analyzing our potential tenants from the minute that we first start contacting us. Just little things like if a tenant application is filled in really neatly, that's a strong indicator for me that it's probably going to be a good tenant. If the tenant, I can't get information from him and they're never sending the right information and documents, there's enough red flags to say this could be a challenging tenant. So we've got to pre-screen our tenants in just the way they interact with us and the way we interact with them. So ask questions of tenants. When I'm doing tenant viewings, I'm asking where they're staying at the moment, how's it going. I'm trying to find out any clues or any alarm signals. When a tenant is constantly complaining about all their previous landlords, I know I've been long enough in the business to know that it's probably not all the landlord's fault. It's probably the tenant's fault as well. So those are alarm signals that I would look out for. It's going to step 3, and to what I was saying earlier, is that you want a completed tenant application. So don't process the application unless you've got the filled in application and that you've got all the relevant documents. That's ID of all the occupants. You've got salary slips and you've got bank statements of the tenants. If you do have all those factors or all those documents, then I would commence, which is step 4, is commence processing the application, which is step 4, which is called follow the flow chart. I'm just going to walk through the flow chart. So we want to check that does the tenant and occupation attributes meet the requirements of the property. So if the tenant is applying for the 1st of January, but the property is only available from the 1st of February, that's a question mark that you want to just filter. The number of occupants, check that. Some body corporates or many body corporates and properties only allow a certain number of people, say like a 2-bedroom property, say 4 occupants, for example. So check that. And so check the number of occupants that is on the application form. And then check if another factor would be pets and any other specifications you may have. For example, I was doing a viewing the other day, and this lovely potential tenant had 4 cars plus a bakkie. And there were only 2 parking bays in this property. Now, he could have maybe parked some of those cars in visitors parking, but I know that particular complex was super strict on visitors parking. So that in itself is a challenge when they list five motor vehicles for a 2 parking bay property. So if the tenant and occupation attributes are meeting the requirements of the property, then you can go into the next stage, which is checking if the tenant is financially suitable. So is the tenant's income at least 3 months of rent? Is their rent payment history good? Are their bank statements good? And this, by the way, on documents, we find that 1 out of maybe 5 tenant applications have fraudulent documents. So just don't look at everything. If something doesn't look right, it's probably not. So I'm not saying be just completely mistrust every single person out there, but also be awake to the fact that in some areas you get a lot of fraudulent applications. And quite frankly, I don't blame many of them because these are desperate times. But don't take everything at face value. Really do put your detective hat on when you're doing an application. So if the financial data is not suitable, then typically we would ask the tenant if they've got a guarantor, someone who can sign on their behalf in terms of the lease agreement. If they do, we then get the tenant applicant, well, we get the details from the guarantor like we would from the tenant. And if they do not have a guarantor, then we reject this application from a financial aspect. So now we got, so now that the tenant has met the financial obligations, or it looks like they've passed that, then we can, then we do a couple of other checks. We do an online credit check, which is typically through Tenant Profile Network. If they've got a good credit record, we go on to referencing the landlords. And if the landlord references are good, then we're checking the employment and checking that the salary that is on the salary slip is in fact legit, and that they do actually are employed where they say they are employed. And then we check on some personal references. And for some tenants, we may do a social media check just to double check that everything is in order. So yeah, and if those are all, if the tenant's qualification process go through all those hoops, then we approve that application. So as you can see, it's a fairly rigorous process, but if you use the flow chart that we've got and the little guide that we've got, which you'll find on the expertlandlord.com, and follow that process, you'll find that, and use it as a guideline, you'll find that the process is not that complicated. As I said, please keep your eyes open and yourself awake to potential challenges of the tenant. Don't be dictated by emotion. Don't try and help out people. Help out people if they've qualified on the criteria that you've set. Going through, so now that you've placed a tenant or found a good quality tenant, now what you want to do is draw up a lease agreement. A lease agreement is the most important document in this whole transaction. And what it is a contract between you as a landlord and the tenant. And the nice thing about a lease agreement is that it actually depersonalizes the relationship, because as much as the tenant is obligated to meet the obligations of what the lease agreement says, so is the landlord. And so if the tenant is not performing according to what the lease says, you can then say to the lease to tenant, we both signed this document. Both of us are obligated to meet what we both signed on this contract, and therefore you can then give them notice or breach notice that they haven't performed according to the lease agreement. But it's not you saying it, it's the fact that we both agreed on this contract, and it's a contract that we agreed to that is now calling the shots or setting the rules. Some essential clauses on a lease agreement. Let me just go through some standard ones. Oh, by the way, a lease agreement, let's make it understandable. We can use the word landlord instead of lessor. We can use the word tenant instead of lessee. One of the requirements of the Consumer Protection Act is the fact that the lease agreement needs to be understandable in simple language. It doesn't have to be in fancy legalese. In fact, the simpler the language, the better. I would also make your lease agreement as fair as possible. Typically, tenants are going to say the lease agreement is more against them than for them. And maybe that's the case sometimes, but I would tend to make the lease agreement as fair as possible, because if it's unfair or it's just unreasonable, that's setting yourself up for failure. What you want to do is build a trust relationship between you and the tenant. And if you've got a fair lease agreement, which is fair to both parties, in the long term, that's going to give you the best kind of success and long-term performance. So some essential clauses: you want the names and addresses of the two different parties. You want the property description. You want the rent amount, what a reasonable escalation date would be, what date you expect payment on your rent. You want to put in the lease period. You want to state the commencement date and the termination date. You want to list the rights and the obligations of both landlord and tenants. You want to have a clause about what happens to the deposit and the amount of the deposit. You want to talk about inspections. You want to just bring in penalties if there's non-performance by the tenant. You want to just mention something about subleasing, and if there happens to be transfer of the property, or the property gets sold while the tenant is in the property. Some other clauses you might want to consider is about pets. You might want to mention insurance, and how the tenant is obligated or responsible to insure their own goods within the property. You can mention something about that alterations can't be done to the property without prior permission from the landlord. You can bring in an early termination clause. You can talk about access arrangements and so forth, repairs and maintenance. So I mean, those are typically some of the main clauses within a lease agreement. Where you're going to get a lease agreement, Tenant Profile Network, Seller Good Lease Agreement, the expertlandlord.com, you can get a lease agreement from there. Otherwise, people can just contact me, and you guys can contact me, and we can talk about. I know EDPF have a great lease agreement as well. So, but I wouldn't get. I had a lease agreement with a big landlord the other day, and they sliced and diced that lease agreement all over the place. Lease agreement, there are some standard clauses, and then over time you will build. You'll use your own experience and fine tune that lease agreement over a period of time. By the way, with a lease agreement, you want when you hand it over to a tenant, you want the homeowners association or the sectional title management scheme rules to be placed with the lease agreement. Obviously, the rules on a sectional title complex, there are rules, conduct rules, and you can't hold the tenant liable for performance around those rules unless you add it to the lease agreement. So just remember to always put the rules, the conduct rules with the lease agreement on sectional title schemes. So now you've got your tenant to sign your lease. You want to onboard your tenant for success. This is where the tucky hits a tar. You want to just make sure that your lease is signed. Don't ever hand over keys until the money is reflecting in your bank account. I had this experience this past weekend where a tenant was desperate to move in. They made a payment late on Friday night. We checked the bank statement both on Saturday and Sunday. The money wasn't in yet. And I had to hold out with the tenant to say, unfortunately, only when the money is reflecting can we then hand over keys, which fortunately it did on Monday morning, and we could set up a move-in inspection. So make sure don't hand over keys unless the money is in your bank account. The money, and typically you would charge the first month's rent together with a deposit. Your deposit amount is typically anything from 1 to 2 months. Typically in Johannesburg, it's about 1 month deposit. In Cape Town, it's more 1.5, 2 months deposit. And in different cities, it depends on where you're at. Also depends on the quality of the tenant. So, for example, a foreign citizen or someone with their own business, there might be a slightly higher deposit than with a local who has a long-standing, well-paying job and with a very, very clean credit record. So your deposit amount would determine by the quality of the tenant. But in your own mind, do have your own kind of criteria as well. You obviously want as much deposit as possible, but in the tough times that we're in now, I'm finding that overall the deposit amount has dropped a little. In the past, we could definitely expect 1.5 months in Johannesburg, but most areas in Joburg, we're more expecting towards a 1 month at the moment. So at the move-in, you're going to do your move-in inspection. The Rental Housing Act says you need to do a joint move-in inspection with your tenant. The way this practically works is that we've got a move-in inspection form, and we walk around the property, and I'll make notes on where I find the little snags are, marks on the wall, marks on the floor, kitchen cupboard that's maybe not 100%, for example. I make that notes on the move-in inspection form, and then I walk around with the tenant at the property, pointing out all these items. And then the tenant signs that move-in document, the move-in inspection form, at the end of our joint move-in inspection. So that the reason why we want that is for 2 reasons. It protects the tenant on the move out so that they are not held responsible for any damage that might have been at the property when they moved in. And second of all, it allows the landlord to hold the tenant responsible for any damage over and above fair wear and tear at the property. So, and that's super important, because if you're spending, let's say, 1,200 Rand cleaning, 1,000 or 2,000 Rand cleaning up your property after a tenant's moved out, and you could have held the tenant liable for that damage, then you're losing out, and that's where you want to be claiming from the tenant. Obviously, a move-in inspection allows you to have a move-out inspection. If you've got the quality move-in inspection, you can use that same document on the move-out, preferably if you've got photographs as well. If the tenant disputes, and at the move-out inspection, this is where the landlord and the tenant often stop becoming friends. You then got proof to say, I did this move-in inspection. It was not noted on that inspection this excessive damage, the writing on the wall, whatever, was not there at the move-in, therefore I'm holding you as a tenant liable for the repair of that excessive damage. So I'm hoping that makes sense. After the move-in, I would, by the way, at the move-in, I would also list all the keys and at the keys handover. So when you hand over keys, you've got a list of the keys you've handed over, and you can hold the tenant liable on the move out, and you can count those keys on the move out. Bearing in mind, it's not about the key itself, which is necessarily expensive. It's the arrangement of that key, which is and getting that key replaced, which is often more the expense. So I'm hoping that works on a move-in, on the move-in and onboarding process. Hopefully that's been useful. After the move-in, I would then email the tenant a copy of that inspection form. I would then make sure my filing is up to date, that the lease agreement, the signed lease agreement, the inspection form, the photographs are all filed perfectly online in Dropbox or Google Docs, wherever you're filing your stuff. And if you've got hard copies, putting in a neat tenant folder in that particular property. Just set that up from day one. And so now, if a tenant now in 6 months' time or 3 months' time has got a query, or you've got an issue with the tenant, you can immediately go to that particular file and refer to that page in the lease agreement, or refer to that inspection form, and so forth, and that will help. You want to keep your tenant happy. Now we're getting to the rental management side of the process, and you want to keep your tenant happy. And one of the ways of keeping them happy is by that first impression, by doing this onboarding process as what I've just spoken about. The second thing, and a big frustration for tenants, is a lack of communication. If there had to be one key word in our game, it's about communication. And it's about being responsive. Now, I'm not saying being slavishly responsive to every woman fancy of a tenant, but we find that when we work with landlords who are responsive, we can work with, you are engaging with us, we get the best performance. So you just want to be engaging with your tenant and be responsive and get back to them when they've got queries. Don't just disappear into the dark of night and appear again one day before the tenant move out. Deal promptly with maintenance issues. Big challenge. The reason why maintenance is so important, not only for the long-term asset growth of your property, but also it gives less excuses for your tenant not to pay. So just bear that in mind, is that you want to do your maintenance quickly. Obviously, if you don't maintain your property quickly, sometimes there's excessive damage to the property because of delay in you getting onto that maintenance. You want to be proactive with preventative maintenance over a period of time. As I said, over a 45-year period, you probably want your property repainted, for example. Be aware of these things when you're doing your inspection. You want to respect your tenant's privacy, although it is your property. When the tenant's got occupation, it's their space. And, even if you're being, just be respectful. And even if you're just showing that you're being respectful, it gives that sense of personal respect, which is actually a big need of tenants, is that sense of, not only am I being heard, but do I feel like I'm being heard? That sense of respect. And then win your tenant's heart. As I said, it's if you can win your tenant's heart, this is not about being best buddies, but if you do your business performance and you look after and you engage with your tenant is going to be motivated to then perform for your property in the long term. And that just moves on to rent collecting. Bear in mind, we often talk about inspections, and that's a big fear of landlords and so forth. Inspections, the best solution to an inspection is, eviction, is not to get to an eviction. Just remember this, prevention is better than cure. We manage thousands of properties and we maybe do 1 or 2 evictions a year. Is because if you manage your property professionally from day one, number one is if you keeping your property neat, so you're attracting a quality tenant, you're doing strong tenant vetting procedures, you're doing a strong move-in, onboarding process with the tenant, if you're doing your maintenance, if you're reacting to your tenant, you're following up your rent payment professionally, you're then going to find that vast majority of the time a tenant's going to perform. Often, and if you manage them professionally, if the tenant doesn't pay on day one or in month 2 on day one, you're immediately starting your debt collection process. So remember on evictions is that many evictions shouldn't happen if you manage your property professionally. Prevention is better than cure. I'm not going to go into the whole eviction process at the moment, but nevertheless, if the tenant is not reacting to your phone calls, your letter of demand, I would move. And now this tenant has definitely lost a job, and they are showing very clear signs of not wanting to move out. I would move towards contacting a specialist eviction attorney sooner rather than later. Don't wait around for 3 or 4 months hoping it's going to get better, because it's probably not, and you've lost 3 months of good rent already. The key thing on evictions is to get the keys back. The second factor on evictions is to then get back any monies that you may have lost in lost income. But the key thing is always to get occupation of your property. So now on the move out of your tenant, I would suggest that you send a move out inspection, move out expectations form to your tenant, so they know what to expect on the move out. Then I do a joint move out inspection with the tenant. I then, if there's no damages on the property, I then have to pay back the deposit to the tenant plus interest within 7 days. If there is some damages to the property and we need to get some repairs done, I need to pay back the remainder of the deposit within 2 weeks of the move out. As per the Rental Housing Act. Just sort out this kind of admin sooner rather than later. Don't fuss or take too long with it. As I said, the move out is often a time where you and the tenant stop becoming friends. But then again, if you've got an attitude of always being fair, firm but fair, have that attitude. In other words, don't be a softie, but also don't be unreasonable. We've had some landlords where they're just patently unreasonable, where they're claiming damage from a tenant. And one of the things we're dealing with at the moment is there's some settling cracks. And the landlord just can't understand how we can't hold the tenant responsible for settling cracks. Now we need to get our 3 contractors to give a report as to why settling cracks is not a tenant issue. But those are just unreasonable. But I mean, if there's writing on the wall or they painted it purple, the wall's purple, clearly that's a tenant issue. So be firm, but be fair. And in the long term, I think that's just good business advice. I think I've pretty much covered most things on what I wanted to cover on rental management, a lot of the foundational things. Guys, what I can do is I'm just going to, in as a summary, I've got 10, what I call the 10 secrets of property management. And I've got 3 minutes now in which to tell you, okay, just remember these 10 things. I'm just going to go through that very quickly. Okay. The first thing is know your why. If you know your why as to why you're doing property investing and why you're managing your tenants, that's going to keep you motivated for the long term when the hurdles do come along your way. It's going to happen. If you've got one property, and let's say you have one problem every 10 years, which may happen or may not, you're going to have the one problem every 10 years. If you've got 10 properties, it means you're going to have one problem a year. And if you're not motivated to go through those little hurdles and to build the systems around those hurdles that's going to come your way, and you don't know your why, you're going to end up getting out of the business. But I mean, you guys, as business people, know that you've got to have a motivation for any business endeavor. Number 2 is your property investment is a business. This is not a game. It's not a hobby. Run it like a business. Pretend that you're running 100 properties and put systems in for your one property as though you're running 100 properties. If you can manage one property in 1 hour a month, that means you can get 10 properties on your books. If you're taking 2 weeks to manage one property, you're never going to grow your portfolio much. So use it as a business, make your decisions around business, not emotion, and you're going to get the best long-term success. Secret number 3.
David, that was absolutely amazing. Sorry that I've cut your word.
No, great.
I really just want to open up the floor to our guys. So before I do that, before I ask Jared and Matt L to ask whatever questions they have, I'd like to just ask you 1 or 2 questions myself, because every time I listen to you, I learn new things all the time. I've been in the game for 20 years and I still learn when I hear you speak. So there's a couple of things 3 questions that I just quickly want to ask you, and I'm sure the answers will be quite quick, and then I'll open the floor to Jared and Matt Al. So the first question that I have, if I don't want to manage my own property, how do I get hold of you to look after my property, and how much will you charge me?
You can get hold of me at my email address or my cell phone number. Would you like me to say that?
Yes, please. Yeah, absolutely.
My email address is david@chorusproperty.co.za. That's CHORUS property.co.za. And my cell phone number is 082-417-5366. That's also my WhatsApp number, 082-417-5366. Our charges depend on where the property is and the size of the property and the rental amount. But typically we're charging 8 to 12% of the management fee of the collections each month. But typically for a standard investor property, 10 to 12% of the value of the property. I mean, if it's a 2,000 rand rental, it's going to be closer to the 12%. If it's a 15,000 rand rental, it'll be closer to the 10% per month.
Okay, fantastic. But obviously, I can negotiate that with you. If I'm an EDPF candidate,
Yep.
then I'll come to you and I'll say I'm with EDPF. You're obviously going to give me a good friends and family discount.
Just let me say, Nigel, your name is great power. Hopefully not too much familiarity. So if someone mentions your name, my ears prick up.
Okay, fantastic. So that's my first question. The second one, if I buy a property where it already has a tenant in it, so there are sort of three sub-questions to this. What do I do to make sure that it's a good tenant and that I want to hold on to that tenant? If the tenant is, after my investigation, is a bad tenant, how do I get rid of them before I take ownership? But if it's a good tenant, how do I hold on to that tenant after I then take ownership?
Okay, so that really comes down to, I would suggest the tenant vetting process is part of your due diligence when you're actually purchasing the property. And I would suggest your offer to purchase. I mean, this is slightly above my pay grade because I'm not, Nigel, this is more your space on the investment side. I would say this offer to purchase is subject to the tenant screening. If the tenant screening is successful, then you're happy to have transfer with the tenant in it. If the tenant screening is unsuccessful, then you'll take transfer on vacant occupation. And because what you don't want is you don't want yourself as a new property owner to then have to do an eviction or get rid of a tenant that you're not happy with. You want the responsibility ideally on the seller.
All right, awesome. Then, okay, then my last question to you, for sake of the audience, if I have a good tenant, all right, and I'd like to hold on to that tenant, do you have any ideas that you can pass on to us in terms of how I can retain that tenant? What kind of things can I do as a landlord in order to hold on to a good tenant?
Is this of a property that you're purchasing, or is this a general that you got a good tenant?
Just in general, if I've got a good
Okay.
tenant, if I own the property already, how do I hold on to that tenant?
So in these times, the first thing is money, right? If the market valuation of my property is typically about 8,000 rand a month, right? Then typically, and now you typically have an 8,000, and let's say you're getting 8,000 rand. And now that's the end of the lease and you're actually doing another valuation, you realize it's still 8,000 rand. And in some respects, some areas, the rent has come down slightly. It's tightening up a little now, but rents actually come down in certain cities in the last 18 months. I would not push that increase on the tenant. I would rather keep a good tenant at a slightly lower rental than I'd like than to push an increase, because number one is that tenant itself, you know what you rather the devil you know than you don't. And number two is that if you were to remarket that property, you're going to get less for your property anyway. So the first thing is money, is be generous or proactive in negotiating your rent. Number two is make sure your maintenance is up to date, and ask your tenant, like, is everything under control? Is everything fine? And number three is a tenant happy in relating to you? I mean, are you being responsive? Are you doing those basic things which I mentioned just now, giving good customer service and so forth? But we find a business-minded person who is a reasonable customer service-oriented person hey, it's great dealing with landlords like that. Hey? Yeah. You know, I had a landlord that was a very, very busy doctor, and he was constantly, you know, he would do his own things himself. For example, like if the gate motor broke, he would do it himself. It's like, dude, you took 3 weeks to get there. And so the tenant churn on his property portfolio was much higher than it should have been, just because tenants got frustrated on the small little things. You know, like when I was renting a property with my wife in Parktown North a number of years ago, the landlord wouldn't spend 500 rand to fix up the electric fence. Like, come on, dude. And of course, I was kind of okay with it. I mean, in Joburg, so you wanted security, but it was a big deal for my wife. And like, we're determined not to renew our lease.
All right, awesome. That's some great advice, and thank you very much for your time here. But let's just quickly check in with Jared and Matt Al. Jared, do you have any questions or comments for David?
Sure, I don't have any questions. I think it was a sort of a good thing that you mentioned now that changed the way that I'm thinking about this is that, you know, you're still providing a service to a client. As much as they are renting from you. I think a lot of the attitude is that, oh, you need me, you need to stay in my property. No, you've got to make them comfortable enough that they want to stay on longer. So that was some great advice there, and especially around the precautionary measures you can take with regard to contracts. You know, I think as the climate changes economically, one has to relook these contracts to make sure that they're still going to be paying rent, you know, and that they can't sort of slack on that. They can't use the pandemic as an excuse or, you know, that kind of thing. So,
Yep.
so I think because I'm saying that because I've heard so many friends who have properties go through this now, where they can't get them out. You know, it's the tenants are saying, you know, they've pay cuts and all this stuff because of the pandemic, and they've been struggling. So for me, this is quite useful and information that I can definitely pass on. And for me, being sort of a first-time property investor, it's going to be good to know this. You know, I'm grateful that I don't need to bump my head that hard um, just yet. But so I am grateful for all of this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think personal excellence of one's own self in providing excellence to a tenant and in expecting that excellence from the tenant as well. I think it goes both ways, and I think
Yes.
some landlords forget that it does go both ways. Also, we're in a very tough market at the moment, and there's a fair amount of properties available, and we are actually competing against other landlords. So, so providing an excellent customer service means that we're going to be more competitive in the long term.
Love it.
All right, awesome. Thanks for that, Jared. Matt Al, you being somebody who already has 2 properties, can you maybe shed some light, some insights that you have, or are there any questions that you want to ask David to help you to further your property portfolio?
Thanks so much, Nigel. No, I think for me, there was also just quite a bit of learning. Personally, I had taken the route of having a rental agency managing for me only because of the busy schedule that I have. But it was also coming from a point of this was someone who I'd bought my first and second property from. So the decision wasn't too difficult to make. The trust was already built. So even now I'm quite happy with the management they've been doing. But I think it like Jared said, it did get quite tricky, especially with the pandemic, where I went through cases of someone who was the best tenant, always on time, you know, sometimes even early for, you know, 2-3 years straight, and then come the pandemic and they were late. So it was also having to exercise a bit of, like you say, I'm also a nice person, you know, but you also can't bring your emotions into this. It's still business at the end of the day. So it's also, how do you strike a balance? Because you want to be human. Like this person literally, like I say, they had been paying for 3 months straight, 3 years straight. And then, you know, during the time of the pandemic, they were late the one time. But it was based off their track record that we made the decision to just give them, you know, leeway for that 1 month to recover a bit, and then they were back on track. But it's not something that I would ever advise, because we were not really guaranteed. So again, I think listening to you, it was just reiterating that Ntabi, don't forget that it's business at the end of the day, and you also need to put your emotions aside when doing it. And that's why I think also for me, I felt more comfortable having an agent, having to sometimes be the bad wolf, you know, especially for the rental collection. But there was one other thing that stuck out for me. Oh yes, I think it was also vetting your tenants very well. How do you actually see that this person is a good tenant? So yeah, it was just all those points that you mentioned that also I kept note of.
Cool.
Just for future, because at the end of the day, in order for you to be cash flow positive, you need rental income. So if you've got a bad tenant, then automatically you're negative because they won't pay consistently.
Yep.
I wanted to ask something very quickly, if I may. Sorry. Was in Cape Town, there are lots of sort of flats up for sale now, and when I call some of the agents, because I've been shopping around trying to see what I can invest in, a lot of the feedback is that people just actually can't afford the deposits. So I wanted to ask you, is it a good idea, if we are in a predicament that we are in with levels rising and people losing jobs or pay cuts happening, is it a good idea to maybe then not do a deposit and just do month to month, and just so that you can sort of kickstart the business? Because I know there is a bit of struggle. I've been phoning a lot of agencies, so just wanting to ask.
Are you saying that the tenants can't afford the deposits?
The initial deposit, yeah.
Yeah, look. I mean, times are tough. I mean, the COVID was once in a generation happening, and every professional landlord came to the party, as what Mario illustrated, and then you obviously tightened the screws again after a few months. The Ubuntu was super important in the beginning, and then you had to kind of tighten things up again. Look. The challenge in the market nowadays, and this is why it's more competitive, is you have to do really professional marketing and get a lot of people through your property. I would highly recommend to not compromise on that deposit, almost at any cost. It does mean that's what happening is that we've got some wonderful people. I mean, I'm just marketing this property in West Joburg. I mean, it's a 9,000 rand a month property. Out of 3 applications I got in a week, I had to reject 2 of them. And it took me 2 months to get those applications in, and I had to reject 2 of them. And the third one, I managed to just hold on to. So you're going to be processing and screening a lot more tenants than you would have 5 years ago.
So it's a fuzzbait story.
Yeah. You got yeah. And this is where you'll gain the wisdom over time, but this is where the EDPF and Nigel and guys like myself can just give you a little bit of perspective. 3 years ago, you put something on Gumtree, you got 100 applications and 99% of it were fine. That same ad in Gumtree will get you 2 inquiries and maybe, 1 application. And out of that 1 application, you're only going to accept half of them, if that. So times are a bit different. Maybe it'll be a little bit better in 2 years' time. But right now, you got to hold the fort.
Okay. And for you and Nigel, I just want to ask, we are in this predicament now. How are you both feeling about the climate and what you've sort of been seeing with rental and sort of the way that it's going? How are you feeling as people who do invest and have seen these changes come about? Has it shifted the kind of clientele that you now get? Are you experiencing a little bit of strain in terms of your portfolio? If I may ask that.
Let me go first. David, maybe I'll answer the question completely and then you don't have to respond. So to be honest with you, I'm actually feeling very positive about the climate that we're in at the moment. Even though, yes, as you rightly said, the pandemic has caused a lot of issues in terms of people being able to pay, people paying deposits, etc., etc. What I feel positive about as an investor is that everybody's selling cheap. So if you can buy cheap when things are bad, then when things are good, you'll make a lot of money. So I'm feeling very positive, not about the climate we're in right now, but the climate that we are approaching. because we are slowly coming out of the worst. I mean, we're already out of the worst of the pandemic, even though there's a lot of new cases and so on. But we've got a handle on it. We understand it. We know where we're at. There are medications. There's the shot, etc., etc. So I'm feeling exceptionally positive about the very near future, that we will get out of this quite quickly and soon. And by that point, we will then get to a point where those of us who have taken a chance when things were bad, that we'll make a lot of money, and our return on our investment will be much higher because we invested when prices were low. In terms of how things have happened and the pain that landlords have had to take across the board, everybody, regardless of who you are, whether you only have one property, one house or one apartment, or whether you're a massive corporation that has billions of rands of property, everybody has taken pain, some worse than others. And that's just the way of life. Good times come, bad times come. And we just need to be prepared for both.
Yes.
So when the good times are there, you need to save enough so that when the bad times come, that you can make it through, and then you recover when the good times come again. We live in cycles, ups and downs, troughs and hills, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, if you plan correctly and you save enough, you will be able to get through the bad times. And when the good times come, then you can party again. So that's sort of just, those are the only thoughts that I have on it.
That's why I've asked what I've asked, because the general sort of appetite and conversation around this has been one of fear when I talk to peers and friends and we talk investment. And I think people to understand that we are, yes, in this economic predicament, but it does lend itself to you getting properties at a cheaper rate. And like you're saying, eventually when things do turn around, you're sitting on a pretty impressive investment. And I think that's sort of stressing the fact that this is long term. It's a long term investment. And so one has to, as you've mentioned, save and understand how property actually works, So I just wanted to pose that question and be a bit of devil's advocate.
100%, yeah. 100%.
That's a very good question, because when I bought my properties in 2006, 2007, I thought we were superheroes, or many of us were. We were stupid, and we bought on the property rise, and it was impossible to lose. Now what's happening is you actually have to be skillful. You actually have to know your stuff. And if you know your stuff, there's money to be made. Like in any business, it's a competitive environment. And we've got a cross-section of landlords. The landlords that were engaged, that did the basics right. And this is when I'm saying I'm super realistic on the way the market is. It's not that I'm negative. It's that if we are realistic about the way things are, and we're professional, the things that I spoke about and I mentioned and what Nigel's mentioned is going to pretty much guarantee you success. Like don't invest in properties now because you're thinking of a 20% increase next year. Buy your property because the numbers work today.
Yeah.
And if a property prices go up, well, that's great. If they don't, you're still safe. And you're doing the basic management. So as just the last thing on KPIs. So when collections are down and occupancy levels are down, let me tell you about our examples. 3 years ago, we were looking at 98, 99% occupancy across our portfolio. We're looking at about 99% collections across our portfolio, right? As a whole, as a general thing. Nowadays, and through the pandemic, it went down to by about 12% occupancy down, vacancy, and it went down to about 92% collections. We're now back up to not 98 or 99%, but we're back up to about 98% collections, and we're back up to about 95, 96% occupancy levels. So in other words, it's not like the market has crashed. It's just that the percentage is a little bit lower than normal. So when you're doing your figures with your due diligence with the EDBF team, don't expect 1% vacancy. Just put your vacancy at 3 or 4%. It doesn't kill the deal, but it makes it a bit more realistic. That's all we're really saying. The market's not that terrible on a well-run portfolio. You're still getting adequate performance.
Yes, listen, that excites me. And as you can tell by my background, I'm chilling at the beach. I'm definitely attracting some success into my life.
Clearly.
So we'll be chilling together very soon on a yacht.
All right, guys. So, yeah, wow, this was an amazing session. And And David, as always, I'm just so thankful, grateful, impressed by everything that you do with us as the EDPF. You are always so generous with your information. I know you run a property management business, and as you educate our people, you lose business, because if you educate them, then they do it themselves, and you actually then lose the business. So just bearing that in mind, I'm even more grateful by you sharing your knowledge and your years of experience with us. So, David, thank you very much for your time. Jared and Matt, I'll thank you again for your time. Thank you especially to the public for watching us and listening to us.
Thank you.
And hopefully learning and being able to implement our strategies and our methodologies, so you too can start your property journey as we journey together in this 50-day property challenge. Guys, thank you very much, and thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again tomorrow.